Before cities carved their names on stone, before kings claimed the earth as inheritance, there are whispers of a different age, an age when humanity was not alone in shaping destiny. Across ancient traditions, from desert scrolls to fragmented tablets, one unsettling pattern repeats: beings of immense presence walking beside early mankind. Not gods, not quite human, something in between. They were remembered as giants. But what does it truly mean when a civilization says it once lived beneath shadows? Were these stories attempts to explain ruins too large to comprehend? Or do they preserve a memory of imbalance, a moment when power crossed a boundary it was never meant to cross? If giants once walked the earth, the real question is not how tall they were. The real question is what changed after they arrived. Welcome to Hidden Origins. Tonight, we return to the world before the flood, not to repeat legend, but to examine what it reveals. Long before structured empires, before organized priesthoods and written law codes, humanity stood at the edge of its own development. We were learning agriculture, forming tribes, naming stars, building memory. Then the stories shift. In ancient Near Eastern tradition, there is mention of beings described not simply as powerful, but as born of a crossing, a union between realms that were never meant to merge. The texts are sparse, almost restrained, yet their restraint makes them more unsettling. The word, later translated as Nephilim, does not primarily describe height. It suggests the fallen, or those who cause others to fall. The emphasis is not on measurement, but on consequence. And that distinction matters.
Because when we examine ancient mythologies across cultures, we see something striking. Giant figures almost always appear at transitional moments in human history. They emerge before floods, before collapses, before divine intervention, before resets. It is as if memory preserves them not as heroes, but as catalysts. In the earliest layers of the Genesis narrative, the reference is brief, almost abrupt, as though the author assumes the audience already knows the weight of what is being referenced. Later Jewish writings expand on it, describing watchers, celestial beings who descended and began interacting directly with humanity. But the expansion is not about spectacle, it is about knowledge, forbidden instruction, metallurgy, weapon forging, celestial secrets, manipulation of nature. Civilization accelerated, but without moral maturity to anchor it. And this may be the core of the giant narrative. Not physical dominance, but disproportionate influence. Imagine a young civilization suddenly handed tools it does not yet understand, knowledge without restraint, power without wisdom, scale without accountability. The giants in this framing represent imbalance made visible. They are the embodiment of premature advancement. Across Mesopotamian tablets, we see kings claiming semi-divine ancestry. In Greek myth, the Titans precede the Olympian order. In Canaanite lore, mighty warriors of old are remembered long after their era ends. Over and over again, the pattern emerges: an age of amplified beings, a rise in violence, a corruption of order, a boundary crossed, then judgment, then reset. It is tempting to reduce this to mythology, but mythology, at its core, is structured memory. It encodes trauma, warning, and worldview. And when multiple cultures preserve similar warnings about towering figures who disrupted balance, we must at least ask what the pattern is trying to communicate. Perhaps the giants were not remembered because they were large. Perhaps they were remembered because they represented a threshold humanity was not prepared to cross. A world reshaped too quickly. A power acquired too soon. And if that is true, then the flood narrative that follows is not arbitrary destruction. It is a correction. But before the waters rise, before the watchers are bound, we must understand how this imbalance expanded. Because the giants did not simply appear, they altered everything around them, and the earth, according to the ancient writers, began to feel it. If this journey into forgotten history is expanding your perspective, subscribe now, because this is only the beginning of what the ancients tried to preserve. The ancient accounts never describe the transformation as sudden chaos. They describe something far more unsettling: acceleration. Civilizations do not collapse overnight. They tilt gradually, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. And in the traditions surrounding the giants, what changes first is not landscape, but knowledge. In expanded Jewish literature, the Watchers are remembered not merely as observers, but as instructors. They teach metallurgy, the shaping of bronze and iron. They teach weapon crafting. They reveal hidden knowledge of celestial cycles. They introduce adornment, cosmetics, enchantments, strategic warfare. These details may sound symbolic, but symbolically they are precise. Metallurgy transforms agriculture into warfare. Astronomy becomes astrology. Craftsmanship becomes domination. Knowledge, detached from moral grounding, begins to scale power. And scale is everything. The giants, described as the offspring of this crossing, are portrayed as consuming enormous resources. The texts emphasize appetite, not just for food, but for control. Whether literal or metaphorical, the message is consistent. Their presence strained the balance of the earth. Ancient writers describe violence increasing, social structures destabilizing, authority shifting toward those with amplified strength. When power concentrates rapidly, systems bend around it. Across the wider ancient world, we see echoes of this motif. Mesopotamian king lists record rulers whose reigns stretch impossibly long, ruling before a great flood divides history. Greek mythology describes titans whose dominion precedes the ordered pantheon. In nearly every version, there is an era of magnified beings, followed by containment. What is striking is not the spectacle, it is the pattern. The giant age is consistently portrayed as unsustainable. The texts do not celebrate it as a golden era. They frame it as a distortion, a swelling of influence beyond proportion. And when influence grows without restraint, humanity adapts to survive it. Imagine early societies observing individuals or dynasties whose abilities appeared beyond ordinary human limits. Their dominance would reshape economics, warfare, even belief systems. Myth would not need to exaggerate much to preserve the memory. But the ancient narrative goes deeper than political dominance. It describes moral corrosion. Violence becomes normalized. Exploitation increases. Human identity blurs under the shadow of overwhelming force. The giants are remembered not just as strong, but as catalysts for widespread corruption. In the Genesis account, the phrase used is chillingly concise. The earth was filled with violence. Not disorder, not inconvenience, violence. And this suggests something critical. the imbalance was not only physical or technological, it was ethical. When boundaries dissolve, whether between heaven and earth, power and humility, knowledge and restraint, consequences follow. Some scholars interpret the giants symbolically, representing tyrannical rulers or hybridized mythic memories. Others see them as theological constructs designed to explain why a flood was necessary. But even across interpretive frameworks, one insight remains stable. The world described in these texts became unlivable, not environmentally, morally. And in many ancient traditions, moral imbalance eventually triggers cosmic correction. The flood narrative, then, is not merely about rain and rising waters. It represents a reset of proportion, a restoration of boundaries, a reassertion that power without accountability cannot endure indefinitely. Yet before the waters arrive, the tension intensifies, because correction always begins with recognition.
The ancient writers describe divine observation, a moment when heaven sees what has unfolded. Not ignorance turning to awareness, but patience reaching its limit. This is the turning point. The giants, once symbols of strength and advancement, become symbols of excess. The watchers, once instructors, become prisoners, and humanity stands at the edge of consequence. But here is the deeper layer, the part often overlooked. The story does not frame humanity as passive victims. It suggests complicity. The knowledge was accepted, the power was embraced, the violence was participated in. The giants may have altered the world, but the world responded in kind. And when imbalance becomes mutual, correction becomes unavoidable. The next phase of the narrative is not expansion, it is containment. Because according to these traditions, heaven does not ignore crossed boundaries forever. And when decisive action comes, it reshapes history. If this perspective is challenging what you thought you knew, subscribe now, because the most intense part of this story is still ahead.
Every civilization has a threshold, a point where tension is no longer sustainable, a moment when imbalance becomes visible, undeniable. In the ancient narrative of the giants, that threshold arrives quietly. There is no dramatic speech, no theatrical warning. Instead, the language shifts from description to evaluation. The earth is observed, and what is observed is not merely power, but distortion. The traditions surrounding the Watchers describe them as once bound beings who abandoned their assigned place. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the implication is clear. A boundary was crossed. Order depends on separation, sky from land, sea from shore, mortal from divine. When those separations collapse, structure destabilizes. The giants represent the living outcome of that collapse. But something even more revealing happens at this stage of the story. The focus moves away from the giants themselves and onto humanity's condition. Violence is described as pervasive. Corruption is systemic. Thought patterns are said to incline continually toward harm. The narrative suggests not isolated wrongdoing, but cultural saturation. This is the breaking point. It is important to recognize that ancient flood accounts across cultures follow a similar arc. In Mesopotamian tradition, the gods grow troubled by humanity's behavior. In Greek myth, Zeus decides to cleanse a corrupt generation. In each version, destruction is not random, it follows prolonged disorder. The biblical account is distinctive in one way. It frames the coming flood not as divine irritation, but as moral necessity.
If the world has become structurally violent, then preservation of life requires interruption, and so the correction begins in two dimensions. First, containment. The watchers, the instigators of imbalance, are described in later tradition as bound, restrained, removed from influence. Symbolically, this marks the restoration of boundary between realms. The source of corruption is neutralized. But containment alone does not solve saturation. The second dimension is reset. The flood is introduced not as rage, but as reversal. Water, in ancient cosmology, represents the chaotic deep, the pre-creation state. To unleash it is to momentarily return the world to its unformed condition. It is uncreation, and then creation again. This is where the giant narrative reveals its most profound insight. Civilizations can reach a stage where incremental reform is insufficient. When imbalance becomes foundational, renewal requires starting over. But notice what the story preserves alongside judgment: preservation. A single family is described as walking differently, not perfect, but aligned. The narrative insists that even in a corrupted age, distinction remains possible. This detail prevents the story from becoming fatalistic. The flood is not an annihilation of potential, it is a safeguarding of it. From a historical perspective, flood myths may preserve collective memory of catastrophic regional events. From a theological perspective, they communicate moral structure. From a psychological perspective, they warn that unchecked power eventually collapses the systems that host it. In every layer, the message converges. Imbalance cannot perpetuate indefinitely. The giants, whether understood as literal beings, mythic archetypes, or symbols of tyrannical dominance, serve as a lens. They embody disproportion, strength without restraint, knowledge without maturity, influence without accountability, and disproportion destabilizes worlds.
As the waters rise in the narrative, the age of amplified beings ends. Their legacy becomes memory. Their presence becomes caution. But here is what lingers long after the flood subsides. The boundary that was once crossed must now be guarded. Because history suggests something unsettling. Humanity does not forget its desire for scale. Even after correction, the impulse toward power remains. The flood closes one chapter, but it does not eliminate the question that began it. What happens when we outgrow our moral capacity? That question survives the waters, and it carries forward into every civilization that follows. If this unfolding perspective is deepening your understanding, subscribe now.
When the waters recede in the ancient narrative, the silence is striking. No giants emerge from the mud. No watchers descend again. No immediate return to spectacle. Instead, the story slows. A covenant is established, a boundary reaffirmed. Humanity begins again, smaller, humbler, aware that scale alone is not strength. And this is where the meaning of the giants becomes clearest, because their absence is as significant as their presence once was. In the post-flood world, longevity shortens, lifespans contract, influence fragments, power decentralizes. The narrative subtly suggests that proportion has been restored. Humanity is no longer overshadowed by amplified beings. The imbalance that once defined an era has been corrected. But the deeper question remains: why preserve the memory at all? Why record a strange and unsettling episode about hybrid beings, corrupted knowledge, and cosmic judgment, only to move forward as if history has reset. Because the giants are not merely characters, they are a warning encoded into origin. They represent what happens when boundaries are treated as inconveniences rather than safeguards, when access to power exceeds readiness to wield it, when advancement outruns wisdom. Across later biblical history, echoes of giant figures appear again, the Anakim, the Rephaim, but they are diminished, localized, no longer civilization-defining. The age of world-altering giants does not return. This shift matters. It implies that the pre-flood era was unique, not because of fantasy spectacle, but because it marked an experiment in imbalance. And experiments that destabilize creation are not repeated. From an anthropological lens, the story may preserve memory of ancient rulers who claimed divine lineage, magnified their authority, and centralized control in unprecedented ways. From a literary perspective, the giants function as mythic compression, condensing complex societal collapse into symbolic form. But beyond interpretation frameworks, the narrative carries a consistent philosophical insight. Human flourishing depends on proportion. Strength must align with restraint. Knowledge must align with responsibility. Power must align with accountability. When any one element exceeds the others, collapse follows. The giants symbolize disproportion made flesh, and disproportion always leaves consequences. This is why the flood is framed not as annihilation, but as recalibration, a realignment of scale, a restoration of limits. In modern discourse, we often separate ancient myth from contemporary relevance, yet the underlying structure of the story remains psychologically resonant. Technological acceleration, concentrated influence, access to capabilities previous generations never imagined. These are not supernatural themes, they are human ones.
The giant narrative reminds us that advancement without moral anchoring destabilizes the very world it seeks to improve. But it also reminds us of something hopeful. Even in the age of giants, distinction was possible. Even when corruption saturated culture, preservation existed. Even when imbalance defined the world, realignment was achievable. The story closes not with fear, but with responsibility. The giants are gone. The watchers are silent. The waters have receded. What remains is humanity, aware now that boundaries are not limitations of potential, but protections of it. Perhaps that is why this ancient memory endured across civilizations. Not to terrify future generations with towering beings, but to remind them that scale is never the ultimate measure of greatness. Balance is. And when balance is honored, the world does not need to be reset. If this exploration through forgotten history brought clarity and depth to your understanding, subscribe to Hidden Origins, because the past still holds questions powerful enough to shape the future.